Good morning. Thank you. So welcome. We're going to proceed with panel number 8, which is ideas worth considering. And there were some papers that were really good and submitted for the conference, but necessarily didn't fit into any particular grouping on their own. So these are just a variety of different ideas around the women, peace, and security agenda. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Samantha Taylor, to moderate this panel. Sam?
And thank you. And today, again, we are discussing ideas worth considering. And so with all of the things that we've heard so far in the last 2 days, we want to try and remember that, women, peace, and security agenda is more than just women. It's gender writ large, the ideas of masculine identities as well as women, feminine identities, and how that affects our national security agendas as well as world security. And so when we look at these ideas and we're considering these ideas, we want to take them and try to avoid our biases or recognize our biases and move beyond our biases. So when we look at our panels today, so we're going to begin with Commander Suzanne Brugler, who is currently serving as the Foreign Area Officer for U.S. Third Fleet. She is going to be discussing the genesis and feedback she received to her report article, She's a Warrior, to James Webb's Women Can Fight, originally published in 1979. After her, we will have Ms. Catie Fowler, and he is the project coordinator for Our Secure Future, Women Make a Difference of One Earth Foundation, and she is going to discuss current trends demonstrating the positive effects of the Women Peace Agenda that we have been trying to work through since UN Security Resolution 1325 and other agendas. And rounding out our panel, we have Dr. Suzanna Levi-Sanchez. She's an assistant professor at the U.S. Naval War College in the National Security Affairs Department, teaching the strategy subcourse. And she is going to discuss the informal women's networks in Tajikistan and Afghanistan and how understanding those networks can play into the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So, Susanna?
Okay. Good morning, and thank you, Sam. Of course, you can hear I was attacked by the allergies. I don't see Meredith here. She was in arms with me yesterday, so I'm going to try to power through this. I hope you can hear what I'm saying, but anyway, we'll go ahead and start. Thank you to Dr. Susan Moffett for hosting this in at the Watson Institute. It's such a nice venue to host this event, and we really appreciate it. And I also want to thank you to Dr. Mary Rahm. I am a direct benefactor of the Naval War College Women, Peace, and Security Conferences and the networks that they inspire. Really, it's due to Mary's efforts that this whole area has been exposed to me or revealed to me. And I am just so proud and grateful for all that you've done in this area. Mary, thank you. Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. I do have some prepared remarks that I'm going to read, but I want to provide you a little bit of context. So I apologize up front if I'm patronizing you at all. It's not the intent. I just want to sort of introduce you to a short cast of characters that might be helpful with taking into consideration my remarks. The first off is the Honorable James Webb. He is many things. He is a 1968 graduate of the United States Naval Academy, which is also my alma mater. He is a Vietnam War veteran, a decorated Vietnam War veteran. He medically retired from the Marine Corps, and upon retirement, he got his law degree from Georgetown. He taught at the Naval Academy at the end of the late 1970s. After that, in the 80s, he was the youngest Secretary of the Navy appointed to that position by President Ronald Reagan. And after that, most recently, he's been the Senator of Virginia, Democratic Senator of Virginia. He changed parties just before he ran. He also is a very prolific writer. He has written a lot of books that have been published by the Naval Institute. One of those books I'll mention is called Fields of Fire, and it's critically acclaimed. It's known to be one of the best combat sort of descriptors from the Vietnam War. So he also got the Navy Cross. So a very esteemed individual. He also was nominated a year ago for the USNA Distinguished Graduate Award. And for the uninitiated within the Naval Academy alumni circles, this is a very, very highly esteemed award. He was nominated with, I think, 4 or 5 other individuals. By the way, we have yet to have a woman be nominated for this award, but when he was nominated for this award, there was one distinct group that vocalized their opposition to it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. When James Webb was a professor at the Naval Academy in 1979, he wrote an article for the Washingtonian magazine, and the article was entitled, "Women Can't Fight." Now, I want to preface this. This was James Webb's, this was his earnest, honest thoughts, his view of the world as he knew it from being a combat war veteran. But this happened to be, again, 1979, and the first class from all service academies, all 3, West Point, the Naval Academy, and Air Force Academy, the first class to have women in it, they were seniors that year. They were to graduate in 1980. James Webb wrote this article entitled, again, Women Can't Fight. It was a 10-page diatribe, and it was very unflattering toward the women who were at the service academies. And it really had a profound effect, especially on their last year while they were there, because, as you can imagine, there were a lot of other people that shared the same opinions that didn't believe that women should be attending the service academies because, quite frankly, if a woman was there, then they were taking the place of a man. And so I'm going to go a little bit into that. But it's important background. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am a 1998 graduate of the Naval Academy. When I was at the Naval Academy, about 14% of the student body were women. Not quite yet that, that mass, critical mass to really kind of feel like you're a part of the organization. So we were, a little bit separated, but I will tell you, when I was at the Naval Academy, Congress repealed the combat exclusion law, and the women not only could serve aboard combatant vessels, combatant aircraft, combatant ships, but we did not have a choice. If we were physically qualified, we were going to be assigned to combatant units. Of course, not all of them. Special warfare was still closed. Submarines at the time were still closed. Both of those areas have opened up to women. We have women submariners. We have yet to have a Navy SEAL, a woman Navy SEAL, but I understand there might be a couple of candidates who are interested. But, these were like watershed moments. As a direct result of that, in 1999, I reported to my first ship, USS Mobile Bay, out of Yokosuka, Japan, an Aegis cruiser. We had missiles on board, and I was one of 4 women out of a crew of 350, so that's close to 1%. And then it was a 2-year tour. It wasn't until a year after I reported aboard that we integrated the crew. So I should say the wardroom, the way the Navy handles it is that we would integrate the wardroom first, the officers first, and then once the wardroom was integrated, then we would bring aboard enlisted crew members. So a year into my tour, we introduced, I think maybe somewhere between 20 and 25 enlisted women to our crew. And I will tell you, my life changed substantially when that happened. Just that added extra 20 women, again, a crew of 350, it made all the difference because not all the eyes were focused on me or my 3 colleagues on board. So it was a really big moment for us and for our Navy, just to let you know. The third character I want to introduce you to in my remarks is my sponsor sister. I'm not going to name her. She's still a midshipman. She's a second-class midshipman, which is a junior. But a little bit of background for midshipmen who go to the Naval Academy. The very generous families of Annapolis sponsor midshipmen to sort of a home away from home. So when they do have their one day of liberty, I think generally on Saturday, they have a place to go to outside of the academy grounds so they can sort of, sleep, do your laundry, eat. Those are the things that I did when I visited my sponsor. My sponsor was in her early 30s when she sponsored me, and she still sponsors midshipmen. So all of her kids are my brothers and sisters, and that's the way I treat them. And so my sponsor sister, she was prior enlisted before she went to the Naval Academy. She was in the intelligence community. She is a very confident woman, I would use it as a descriptor, and a little more mature than other people in her class because she's had that experience already in the Navy. So that's just a little bit of prep work here, and I'll go into my prepared remarks here. And I've called my prepared remarks Divita versus Goliath. Okay. Recently, 2 of my Naval Academy classmates and I got together for Sunday brunch in San Diego to discuss projects we each had been working on. One friend, a chef and food blogger, was on a journey to visit all 50 states, couch surfing, offering home-cooked meals in exchange for his bed. The other, a naval aviator, was working to formalize a program he helped design that broke down cultural barriers at work. And I recently had published an article focused on women warriors in the Navy's professional magazine called Proceedings. And this is the Proceedings magazine. You can get it delivered to your door on a monthly basis. I think it says something about the reading demographic that it's still delivered in print. But just to give you an idea, this is, again, our Navy's professional magazine. The article I wrote was a rebuttal to another article written by former Virginia Senator and Secretary of the Navy James Webb, Women Can't Fight, appeared in Washingtonian magazine nearly 40 years earlier. A fellow graduate, Webb had served as a decorated Marine Corps Marine during the Vietnam War, where he sustained injuries and was later medically retired. He was an instructor at the Naval Academy when the first class ever to have women was completing their senior year. Women Can't Fight was an acerbic testimonial as to why women should never have been allowed to attend the military service academies. According to Webb, women had no place competing with men for academy appointments. And upon graduation, they most certainly were not fit to lead men in combat. This same argument concerning women in combat resurfaced about a year ago when Webb was nominated to receive the coveted Distinguished Graduate Award, much to the dismay of the pioneering women in the class of 1980. Webb not only ridiculed them, but he marginalized their very existence at the service academies, which many of their fellow male midshipmen rallied behind. Striking a nerve, that same argument died hard, at least at the Naval Academy it did. Whereas a midshipman 20 years later, the article came out in '79, I graduated in 1998, even I fell victim to the misogyny it inspired because it still influenced attitudes toward women in the counterculture among male midshipmen. And so, when last year my much younger sponsor sister, then a sophomore at the Naval Academy, told me Webb's article was again circulating among the midshipmen, I was shocked. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. Conversations were validating Webb's arguments, and even she herself, a capable and self-possessed prior enlisted sailor, was considering some of his arguments. I knew right then and there that the madness had to stop. Whether we had received credit or not, throughout the course of history, women have served in nearly every role in the U.S. military, and we had just started to rightly earn access to all positions of leadership, including those in infantry combat. My article, She's a Warrior, was my manifesto of what, as a military woman, I knew to be true. Yes, this was the year 2017. And although we had come a long way since 1979, I couldn't bear the thought that women midshipmen might still have to suffer the same prejudices and biases that I had endured 20 years earlier. I just couldn't conceive of it. Something had to change, and I knew I couldn't just sit back and not say anything. The idea that women had not been serving in significant roles shoulder to shoulder with our male counterparts, oftentimes doing a better job at it, was just plain absurd. I knew then, like I know now, military women are and always have been combat warriors. We have challenged and redefined the notion of what it is to be a combat leader, and it's about time that we are recognized for our contribution to the lethality of our fighting forces, officers and enlisted. We have to own it and embrace it and be unafraid in calling it out, even if traditional societal culture doesn't see us that way. After my article was published, believe me, I had many critics. How dare I call out a decorated combat war hero and suggest that he was wrong? People either disagreed with my confidence in women's capability to lead in combat, or they wondered why now was I perhaps overstating the obvious. And I just want to read to you a couple of online comments that surfaced after this article published in Proceedings in November of last year. And I quote, Despite the relentless march of American cultural Marxism and a Pentagon Politburo that keeps a close eye on who's paying for retirement and TRICARE for life, Webb was correct then and remains so. And this is provided by the handle TR2, whoever TR2 is. I'm really glad he read my article. The next comment is, with all due respect, ma'am, you don't need to go there because your point has already been made. Everything comes in its own due time. Semper Fi. And that was from Papa San Pauli. And the third comment, just very plainly, women don't belong on ships. They never did and they never will, period. And that's from, I love this handle, The Plague. Okay, the Plague. That was the handle. All right, so through it all, I know that standing up for what I believe is right was simply what I had to do, if not to counter Mr. Webb, who, by the way, never publicly admitted he was wrong about women admitting the service academies, then to set the record straight on behalf of my younger sponsor sister and her fellow midshipmen, both women and men. Back at our Sunday brunch, my classmate, who was the traveling chef, told me that he had worked as a staffer on Webb's Senate campaign. His very first day on the job, Mr. Webb called him into his office, and knowing my friend was a writer-blogger, he warned him, be very careful about what you choose to write and publish, because over time, the written word can come back to haunt you. The written word lives on. The pen really is mightier than the sword, and the truth reveals itself over time, and self-inflicted wounds can be just as damaging. Thus goes the story of Divita versus Goliath. So that's my little tale there. One thing I do want to mention is Senator Webb did apologize to the women of the class of 1980 for how the article made them felt. He recognizes that he made their life substantially more difficult after his article was published, but he has never come out and said that he was wrong about the fact that women attend the service academies. His actions otherwise might suggest something else, but he's never publicly stated it. So when the awards, just a couple days before the Naval Academy Distinguished awards were presented, I think due to pressure, specifically pressure from this very loud group, the women in class of 1980. By the way, their argument was, yes, Senator Webb is a distinguished graduate, but so are we from the first class that graduated. He declined, the Alumni Association never rescinded the award, he declined the award. And for a postscript, I want to tell you, just last month at the Officers Women's Leadership Symposium, I gave a briefer version of this little story. And funny enough, I wasn't prepared, but there were midshipmen in the audience, and I did have a woman midshipman raise her hand and tell me, ma'am, I was in one of the companies where that article was circulating last year, and I had guys in my company tell me that I didn't belong there. What should I do? And I thought, again, it just shocks me every time. I take it for granted that I serve in uniform and that I lead women and men. So my advice to her was just to hit it straight on. As soon as she hears of it, it's not the easy thing to do, but leading never is. The hard choices in leadership never are easy. And I just told her she had to address it straight away. But again, the story continues to surprise me. Thank you.
Miss Catie Fowler.
Good morning. My name is Catie Fowler, and I am the project coordinator at Our Secure Future, Women Make the Difference. We are the Women, Peace, and Security program of One Earth Future, located in Broomfield, Colorado, where we're working with our sister programs towards a shared mission to catalyze the systems that will eliminate the root causes of war. I wanted to start today by thanking the U.S. Naval War College, the Watson Institute, and Dr. Mary Rahm for providing me with the opportunity to speak with you about our upcoming publication. We're very excited to be producing a publication called Just the Facts, a selected annotated bibliography to support evidence-based policymaking on women, peace, and security. This is my first time speaking as a panelist at this event and my first time at this event in general. So I'm very happy to be here and to be sharing a project that truly speaks to the effectiveness of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. To give a bit of history about this project, the annotated bibliography took place over a 2-year period and underwent a peer review process from 7 experts in the field. This was including members of the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. It spans women, peace, and security-related initiatives in Africa, Asia, the MENA region, Europe, and North and South America, and includes both country-specific case studies and global surveys. It's the first attempt at compiling all of the literature we currently have available that answers this one simple research question. How does implementing the Women, Peace, and Security agenda make international peace and security efforts more effective? The bibliography is not comprehensive, and it doesn't pretend to be so. It's rather very intentionally selective. It does not focus on the impact of conflict on women. It also does not focus on the gendered aspects of armed conflict, sexual and gender-based violence, or on human trafficking. While other bibliographies have been published on similar topics, such as Ending Violence Against Women and Girls, published by Monash University in Australia, and The Role of Women in Peacemaking by the Charter for Compassion, what makes this bibliography so unique is that it distinctly veers away from this long-held focus on women's protection. So instead, we're taking an eye towards providing evidence that women are effective agents of change. And that the Women, Peace, and Security agenda doesn't only increase women's participation, although it does do that, and we're happy it does that, but it also has positive effects for whole communities and countries by improving governance, security, and state peacefulness. It deviates from the human rights argument that women need to be included by virtue of being half the population, and instead focuses entirely on the effectiveness argument, which is that this agenda improves conditions for women, men, boys, and girls alike. We wanted to show what works, what doesn't, what gaps exist, and also what's surprising in the field of women, peace, and security today. As a result, there are 4 components of the annotated bibliography. The first is political participation. The second focuses on peace building and conflict resolution. The third on peace and security operations. And the fourth on countering violent extremism and counterterrorism. Some of these, such as political participation, focus on more quantitative methods, which you'll notice in a second here. Whereas peace building and CVE tend towards more qualitative methods. We felt that it was important to include all of these methods in our review because they're all equally valid in the field. So some of these images provide just a sampling of what we found in performing the annotated bibliography. We also have a little bit more in our one-pager that I brought today. It's just a really brief summary of our findings that will be published in June. So the first and by far the most research section of the bibliography focuses on political participation. The premise of this section relies upon the understanding that women have unique perspectives and skills that improve the function of governments when women have leadership roles in them. This refers not only to the number of women in government, whether they're in parliament, in cabinets, or serving as heads of state, but also to the quality of their participation. As a result, there's a good deal of debate for the best methods to encourage women's inclusion in a way that both increases their numbers and the level of their actual engagement. The method to increase representation that we found was most commonly utilized and, as we've mentioned, also criticized, was the implementation of gender quotas, which often took place following state conflicts, were one of the most tangible methods to guarantee a set percentage of women representatives were able to serve in public office. Now, some of the evidence on gender quotas was very positive. For example, a study across African countries found that increasing the number of women in office to a threshold of 25 to 35% led to a decrease in the gender gap in political engagement. So that is to say that even seeing female representatives in office led to a higher level of voter turnout and participation by other women. However, other findings question just how meaningfully so-called quota women can participate. And the criticism here is that in some contexts, women's participation can be tokenistic or even ineffective if they're not viewed as legitimate representatives in the first place. This is either because of gender bias or because the government itself is viewed as corrupt. So why is it so important to have women in government and to implement such measures? Why is it so important that we have them in office and as public representatives? Beyond a moral imperative for gender equality, having more women in politics also impacts the effectiveness and policy of governments. In terms of effectiveness, a study examining the US Congress itself found that women were actually more effective legislators. Women in the minority party were 31% more effective than their male counterparts at pushing legislation through. And women in the majority party were 5% more effective. Another study that investigated if women were really the fairer sex found a strong and statistically significant correlation between the proportion of women in a given country's legislature and the level of perceived corruption in that state. Furthermore, other studies found a direct correlation between greater gender equality in politics and diminished levels of actual corruption. Although these findings seem to be limited to functional democracies, where the removal of corrupt candidates from office was a viable option. Eric Melander's work found that greater political gender equality, measured by both the presence of women as chief executives and the level of women in parliament, correlated with lower levels of human rights violations at the hands of state agents. In addition to improving effectiveness, when it comes to policy itself, women are also shown to have a significant influence. For example, female parliamentarians are 122% more likely than their male counterparts to engage in a healthcare debate. And while state aggression tends to actually increase when a female leader is the head of state during times of warfare, a study by Mary Caprioli and Mark Boyer found that a 5% increase in the state legislature of women decreases the state's overall likelihood to use violence by nearly 5 times. Another piece by Caprioli that focuses on gender equality based on political, social, and economic rights found that greater state gender equality also led to lower level of likelihood to use military action to settle international disputes. Furthermore, when at least 35% of the legislature was female, it both reduced state likelihood to go to war and reduced the likelihood of a state relapse into civil war to virtually 0. When we turn to peace building and conflict resolution, we see that implementing the Women, Peace, and Security agenda again yields very positive results. This is not only because women and men often have different wartime experiences, but also because the roles that women and men fill in peacemaking have been shown to have different outcomes. So women really do bring something truly unique to the table here. Often cited data from Laurel Stone shows us that including women in the process makes the peace process 64% less likely to fail and 35% more likely to last at least 15 years, meaning that women's participation is the key to sustainable peace. In addition, multiple studies point to women's ability and willingness to reach across divides and build coalitions. This was evident in country case studies such as Northern Ireland, South Africa, and Guatemala, where national women's movements were critical to peace building. When Valerie Norville examined 39 different peace agreements, she found that the 31 that had failed had all also failed to include women. On the flip side, a study conducted by Maria Riley of Inclusive Security looked at 40 peace processes over the course of 35 years and found that when women were able to influence peace processes, an agreement was almost always reached. In fact, there have been no historical instances in which women's participation was shown to have a negative impact on the peace process. And yet there continues to be a lack of women in formalized peace processes. And funding for Women, Peace, and Security program remains low, making up only 6% of total aid and only 2% of aid for peace and security specifically. After the implementation of UNSCR 1325 in 2000, we're beginning to see some improvements in women's inclusion. We're also beginning to see some improvements in the way we talk about peace. So from between 1990 and 2000, women were referenced in peace agreements only 11% of the time. And by 2014, they were referenced in peace agreements 67% of the time. It's a pretty substantial uptake. Returning to our question of how implementing this agenda makes international peace and security efforts more effective, we find similar results are apparent in peace and security operations themselves. Here, including more women has several outcomes that are good for women, as well as for whole communities. Statistical evidence shows that the mere presence of peacekeeping missions can have a positive impact on state likelihood of adopting gender-balanced reforms. Laura Huber and Sabrina Karim found that states without peacekeeping missions had only a 51% probability of adopting reforms, whereas those with peacekeeping missions had a 73% probability of adopting them. In other studies, it was implied that this relationship was actually reversed, and that countries with better pre-existing gender equality were more likely to have successful peacekeeping operations. Either way, there's a very clear relationship here. Amongst peacekeeping forces themselves, the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations found that having a critical mass of women peacekeepers of 30% or higher had a civilizing effect on peacekeeping forces. So that is to say that having women present in UN peacekeeping troops mitigated instances of sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by members of the troops themselves. As peacekeepers, women foster greater community trust and are viewed as more accessible to other women, who are more likely to come forward to report instances of sexual and gender-based violence to a woman peacekeeper than to a man. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, this led to UN mission success when a gender advisor requested an audience with only the women of the community that was experiencing rebel attacks. When the women sat down alone, they felt comfortable enough to speak up about the sexual violence they'd been experiencing at the hands of rebel groups. And they were also able to identify where the rebels had been hiding in the outskirts of the fields where the women worked. This information led to new patrols that not only helped to protect women, but also decreased the number of attacks on the village at night, which had a clear benefit for the whole community. Like peacekeepers, women police officers are also viewed as more trustworthy and approachable. Women in US police forces have been proven to be significantly less likely to resort to excessive force. A study conducted in 2002 found women made up 12.5% of the police force and accounted for only 5% of citizen complaints of excessive force. Male officers were 2 to 3 times more likely than female officers to have a citizen lodge a complaint, and they were 8.5 times more likely than women to have sustained allegations leveled against them. The effectiveness of integrating women into peacekeeping and policing is evident in a variety of country contexts, including in Liberia and Afghanistan, in addition to the DRC in the United States. So we can say that we've seen the effectiveness of this agenda in a variety of country contexts. Finally, the last section of our bibliography examines a burgeoning field of research in CVE and counterterrorism. This field remains under-researched, but the research that does exist strongly suggests that women, and especially mothers, have substantial roles to play in countering violent extremism. Women's added value was made evident in initiatives such as the Daughters of Iraq, where hiring Iraqi women to work at checkpoints and conduct searches of other women helped to mitigate the short-term threat of terrorist attack. Another programming initiative instituted so-called mothers' schools to train women in how to detect radicalization amongst their children and provide counter-narratives in the home. This was shown to have a mitigating effect by lessening their children's likelihood of joining terrorist or violent extremist groups. This body of work needs a lot of further exploration. Specifically, and as some of you have already noted at this conference, we need to know more about why women radicalize and join violent extremist groups themselves, and also how to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of programs that teach women to combat violent extremism. So from what all of this literature suggests, we came up with several recommendations for policymakers to advance the women, peace, and security agenda. The following 4 provide a summary of our key points, some of which overlap with other recommendations we've heard already at this conference. The first is to increase the participation of women in each of these sectors, really, through supply-side solutions such as electoral finance assistance, training, and capacity building, so that women can engage more effectively. The second is to recognize and scale up women's local peace-building efforts and use them as a model for even larger scale efforts in the future. The third is to fund the recruitment of more women into peacekeeping and security forces and build teams to work at the local level. Fourth, and finally, we recommend that we work to understand how women can be integrated into CVE and counterterrorism efforts and build their capacity to do so. So this bibliography won't actually be published until next month, although we do have our one-pagers here, as I mentioned, which has some of the most compelling evidence from our review. From everything we've seen, there is an overwhelming body of evidence in support of women's positive and stabilizing impact in all of these fields. We know from the data in our bibliography that women's participation leads to improved governance, peace building, peace and security operations, and counterterrorism efforts. And we're looking forward to publishing and sharing our bibliography when it comes out, as well as to further research and policy making that takes this evidence into account. Thank you.
And rounding out our panel, we have Dr. Susie Levi-Sanchez from the U.S. Naval War College.
I think I minimized it, right? Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me, Dr. Ram and Dr. Moffat. It's an honor. And also thanks to Dr. Cameron and Dr. Taylor for their support. My name's Suzanne Levi-Sanchez, and my paper is Leading as Daily Practice. It takes a baker to raise a village. It's on female leadership in Khatlan, Tajikistan. I did a lot of research as well, or fieldwork in northeastern Afghanistan, but this is more focused on the Tajik side. My paper focuses, first of all, my research was partially funded by a USAID grant that was implemented through University of Illinois, as well as several other grants. My paper focuses on female leadership within mahallas. The mahalla, which means neighborhood, is the main form of local governance in Tajikistan. Given its deep roots in the region, the mahalla is a natural vehicle for transmitting information, exchanging best practices, and for local development projects. It is also the primary intermediary between informal leaders, their communities, and the state. The official mahalla committee is made up of a president, 1 or 2 deputies, a secretary, and often 2 other members. Many of the mahallas also have street leaders, but not all of them. Some of the mahallas have females on the mahalla committees, but many don't. The role of women in the community and whether they are included or not included in mahalla governance also contributes to the interaction between the household, the mahalla, and ultimately the central authorities which hold access to all of the resources. From outside, Tajikistan appears to have a highly centralized state where local governments have little money, influence, or anything else. However, on closer examination, despite all their problems, local leaders and governments are a key factor for stability, and this includes the female leaders in the mahallas. This map shows where I did my fieldwork. This province in Tajikistan, which is Khatlan, in this area, borders Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. My fieldwork was conducted in 9 districts and 30 villages. It was a 2-year agricultural extension project, and my ethnographic research was to study purely female leadership and how information was transmitted within the villages among these women. Khatlan is the densest populated province in Tajikistan, which is only about 8 million people altogether in the country. The bread cycle. My research found that women's informal leadership in the mahalla serves a vital role in village governance and provides the basis for stability within the civil society in Tajikistan. Locally elected female leaders often were chosen based on a woman's ability to bake the best chapati. And this is a picture of the president of Tajikistan, and this is all over the place as propaganda. And he's basically the father of the breadbasket for Tajikistan because wheat is the primary food source. The baking of bread not only represented daily sustenance and survival, it also is the main staple of every meal and symbol of weddings and funerals. Many important negotiations happen in informal ways at weddings and funerals and at the mosque. Through a woman's access to informal channels of authority due to her skills as a bread baker, a female leader also has the ability to influence local political issues within the mahalla. Essentially, the skill of the bread baker in the mahalla translated to a form of currency within a system that has few avenues for women's participation in the political sphere. How good your bread is literally decided how much power and influence you have. I know that might be controversial, but it's what I found. The female leaders have a wide range of responsibilities. Duties include the mentoring of other women, midwifery, gaining access for women to medical clinics, religious advice, and bread baking for the weddings and funerals in the mahalla. This woman here was a locally elected female leader. She not only led the mahalla I was in, but also a number of other mahallas, and many women came to her for advice, mentoring, and skill building. I asked many of the women how they chose the female leader and which characteristics did they look for when choosing a leader. The majority of women said that a woman's bread baking skills and abilities, cooking and child rearing, were the most important. Most groups agreed that out of all of these skills, her ability to bake bread was at the top. When asked why this was so, they said that it was because of the importance of bread at funerals and weddings and the mosque. The best bread baker was the one responsible for providing the majority of the bread for the weddings and funerals. Again, this led to a currency of authority these women could use as a form to barter to gain access to resources for the Mahala. And resources in the Mahala are, the basic resources are electricity and water. And if your canal gets blocked or your electrical pump goes out, that's it. You know, you're trucking in water, you're walking miles to get water, and your family's maybe not eating. So being able to lobby for those resources is really, really important for women and their children to be able to live. And many of the men are actually working in Russia. So the only access the women have is if they can get access to political figures at weddings, funerals, because they're not allowed in the mosque. The average woman in a village wakes up at 5 a.m. and goes to sleep around 11 p.m. During these hours, she begins her day with praying. It's a primarily Muslim country. Some are more adherent than others. After that, she prepares breakfast and feeds the farm animals. It is at this time that she prepares the dough for the bread. After that, the women work in their household gardens, presidential lands, and as forced labor in the cotton fields during cotton season. They also clean and plant the garden in between if they can. In the afternoon, they prepare lunch for the family. After lunch, they either return to the cotton fields for forced labor or work in their gardens or presidential lands. They then come home and prepare dinner and help their children. They once again feed the farm animals, pray, prepare the sleeping areas for bedtime, then go to bed after their children's homework is done. They have washed and finished any other household chores. Children often, particularly in this part of Tajikistan, end up working in the cotton fields by age 8 or 9 in forced labor. And the women are largely paid in cotton in sticks so that they can actually bake the bread because it provides the fuel for the fire. Most mahallas have a mosque that is at the center of village life. Many mosques have a tea house attached where men congregate. The religious leadership influences most of the decision-making in each mahalla. Women are not allowed in most of the mosques or to be part of the leadership, except during the planning of weddings and funerals. The passing of skills to daughter-in-laws by mother-in-laws, an informal apprentice system, is a vital form of labor and skill development within the mahalla. This has positive and negative aspects. At its worst, the daughter-in-law is tied to a master who exploits her skills without helping her. At best, she's under the tutelage of a benign master who helps build her skills and slowly allows her to have independence over her own dominion. There is a very high rate of domestic violence in Tajikistan between mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws. It's much higher than the men against their wives. So it's a really serious problem, but there are many very supportive mother-in-laws that do actually help the younger women build these skills. This is a young woman. She's walked about a mile to get water from the canal because there's no water in her village area. In the average rural household in Mehnatabad, which is a district in Khatlon, the mother-in-law is in charge of the daughter-in-laws and the men stay out of this domain. The more daughter-in-laws the mother-in-law has, the more power she has both within the household and the mahalla. The daughter-in-laws are her labor force within the household. Her labor force translates again to an informal currency of legitimacy and authority. The more she is able to control her daughter-in-laws as well as train them and make them productive within the household, the more she will have power and access in civil society. While this seems like an incredibly oppressive system, some development projects have actually made this system worse. Some development projects fail to appreciate the importance of these informal leaders to stability and security at the village level, and they do one of two things. They divert scarce resources, such as water and electricity, away from households, or they make children and the daughter-in-laws work as unpaid forced laborers in local business development schemes. Take, for example, this sewing project. In villages where women are too busy to work outside the home, these projects fail. In villages where elite women who are tied to the president's dynastic vertical kinship network live, these women run sweatshops funded by foreign aid that use both child labor and daughter-in-laws to sew garments, burdening the households further. The more the elite women build their businesses, the more the other women are burdened with making these businesses work with no direct benefit. All of the benefits go to the family of the elite female business owner and this dynastic vertical kinship network of the president. In the end, a project such as this takes labor away from the mother-in-laws and their ability to run their households on a daily basis and the subsistence farming that keeps their children and their families fed. This both decreases necessary household production as well as the process of daily leadership practices within the household. This is women in the Wakhan Quarter. That's a whole different subject. I probably shouldn't have had this picture, but there it is. One of the discussions I had with a group of women highlighted the impact of the developing market economy on women's agency and civil society. This particular mahalla was closer to the city of Bokhtar, which is at the center of Khatlan, and had more access to markets than in some of the other villages we visited. This mahalla had a council of female elders instead of one main leader. They told me that a woman's bread baking and sewing skills were a key factor in her authority in the mahalla, but this was shifting. With bread being sold in the bazaars and cheap Chinese clothing flooding the markets, their skills had become less important. Since the primary way women assert agency within the mahalla is through the sharing of skills during informal gatherings, rendering these exchanges unnecessary could have a significant impact on the structure and stability of the civil society over time in Bokhtar and Khatlan writ large. Throughout rural Central Asia and Afghanistan, the oven can be thought of as a hub in the wheel with the spokes emanating from the bread oven. The functions of bread baking interact with the larger economy, may be described as symbolizing women's status within civil society. The oven is at the heart of these broader networks and a woman's role in the family and community. Finally, the Tajik government invests meager amounts into local infrastructure and basic services. It often is assumed that by decentralization, meaning liberalizing markets, the problem of a lack of services will be diminished and it will empower local stakeholders. In reality, the opposite often occurs. Decentralization moves decision-making outside of official channels, thereby decreasing local support for the government and weakening the state. It also disempowers local leaders who function as intermediaries between the state and the local community and decreases their ability to lobby for resources. Decentralization coupled with formalization has counterintuitive results. In fact, it may not only weaken the state, it has the potential to increase conflict. Essentially, even though the state as a whole is very weak and held together primarily through coercion, local governments provide the undergirding that make the state endure. In Tajikistan, the local government is the only game in town, and female leaders are a key part. That's it. Thank you.
We are now open to questions to the panel. Yes.
Thank you to all the panelists. My question is for you, Catie. I'm so excited to hear about this bibliography. As someone who teaches a course on women, peace, and security, you make my life a lot easier. So thank you for that. But what I would like to know is, I mean, you've read through all the resources in the bibliography. I mean, what are some gaps that you're seeing in terms of research that you wish you could have included but just doesn't exist?
You know, I think the biggest one that I mentioned and I'm really excited about is this total gap in understanding how women fit into counterterrorism. I think it's a gap mostly because we've just started doing research and really started to try to integrate them into counterterrorism. So it's very understandable, but I would love to see more research on that or to do more research on that. It's not a gap, but a conflict that I would really like to see resolved is what you were speaking to earlier about gender quotas. Obviously, the same exact tool cannot be implemented the same way across country contexts, but I think we really need to figure out what we need to do to fit this into different country contexts or find another solution that works to enhance women's representation, because the evidence is just really spotty there, and I would like to find a system or a way of approaching this problem that works a little bit better. So I think those are the two that really struck me.
Yes,
So my question is actually a follow-on question for Catie. So I work at the Canadian Forces College, and we're doing an exercise in a couple, actually on starting Sunday, on increasing the number of women in peacekeeping through our LC initiative in Canada. And one of the surprising questions or illuminating questions for me is the recommendation to add more women in peacekeeping, I think is a good one. However, once women start in their peacekeeping roles, how are they utilized? And what are the myths that surround women in peacekeeping that would essentialize what women can and should and ought to do in a peacekeeping role? So is there any literature that talks about that you've come across?
There definitely is. We didn't include all of it because we wanted to focus so much on what women can do as opposed to the resistance they face. Certainly, there's institutionalized sexism everywhere. But there is research that kind of focuses on some of the obstacles they face, and I'd have to remember the title of this book, but I have books somewhere in the bibliography I could send to you. But I think there is a lot of work that's being done that focuses on both the obstacles and the actual impact that women can contribute to peacekeeping. So I'm happy to forward those along to you.
Chloe, and then Michael, and then I saw Sheila in the back.
Thank you. My question is for Suzanna, actually. In this age of the Me Too movement, there are women who are claiming damages done either by men for sexual harassment, sexual assault. Saw this movie where it's called Denial, where a man denies the existence of the Holocaust and was taken to court in England. And so saying that Senator Webb hasn't come out publicly to say that his comments were wrong on women not being able to fight, I'm going to play devil's advocate, are you advocating for taking legal action to say you cannot say this because it seems that the problem won't go away in a legal court to justify that?
That's an interesting question. That would probably be better determined by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I don't know if any of you have seen RBG, the movie. I saw it this weekend. It's excellent. I didn't realize that in the 1970s she defended, and it was actually an Air Force airman who wasn't receiving BAH, and this woman came forward and said, my colleagues are receiving BAH, but because she was a woman, she wasn't allowed to receive it. And it more than doubled her salary. So again, in that legal context, that's not for me to decide. I know that Senator Webb is Senator Webb, and I think, I think he has very strong values. I don't know that today they align with our values. And I also was very careful in my article. And if you haven't seen my article in proceedings, just send me an email. I'm happy to send it to you. It's behind a firewall now. It wasn't for the past 6 months, but now it is. But he was trying to do the right thing for what he felt was right for America. It turned out that wasn't wrong, and it turned out that 4 years earlier, 70% of our legislature changed the law so that women could attend the service academies. But he was doing what he felt was right, and I'm not taking that away from him at all. But I know that he works in a certain way. I will share with you that when I submitted my article to proceedings, I thought I had a 20% chance that they would run it. I really did not think that they would go ahead, but it was something inside me. I had to do something. I had to, putting it was very therapeutic, putting this to paper. I was delighted that they decided to run it. But, Senator Webb, he still publishes. He still works with the Naval Institute. He's been a friend of the Naval Institute for a very long time. So my editor shared with me that when she reviewed my article, that every word was reviewed, like it was very painstaking. And what they published was probably about 2/3 of what I had originally submitted to them. So there you go, just a little more background on the history of this story.
Michael, and then Sheila, and then I'll.
Great. Suzanne, my question is for you as well, and I applaud you for your bravery for publishing that, because that had to take a little bit of an act of courage to say, I want to put that out there. I had a question about your reaction from your own classmates. You were a very small percentage. What was that like, hearing back from your own classmates? And then also, what have you seen in terms of leadership roles of women at the Naval Academy? As you've progressed since 1980, I'm sure there's been more leadership roles, and what has that done to help make this issue go away?
Well, here's the good news story. I will say that my classmates over the years, especially since we've graduated, I think that they've come to really appreciate what women do bring to the table. And again, I was class of 1998. We have all people who are retiring at 20 years, so we're just starting to, I mean, it went by in a blink of an eye. I can't believe I graduated 20 years ago. But that's why this was so shocking, because I've been back to the academy grounds, I've been back to the yard, and I see the women there, and it is a different place than I went there, and that's an absolutely good thing. I mean, I'm very proud to have been there, and I'm proud to have been, forged that better environment for them to be in. And that's why when my sponsor sister wrote me and said, Susanna, have you heard about this article? And I couldn't believe it, and just some rage, And by the way, Senator Webb is a passionate person, okay? He's emotional. And I think, these are descriptors that are generally given to women, but equally so, it's how I felt. I couldn't believe that we were still having these same arguments.
Sheila?
Catie, my question's for you. You said it's the article or the value that we published this month. How do we get our hands on it? Do we go to your website?
It will be on the website. If you want to email myself or contact our organization directly, we're happy to send copies once those are printed. That will take a bit longer than getting it up, but it should be on the website sooner than in print.
Okay, thank you.
Selena?
Yes, question for Suzanne. I'm happy to say that I participated in NAFAC a couple of years ago, and that was when the peace and security focus. So
I wish I was there.
It was a great conference. So they have made improvements. But I wanted to know, did you ever understand what his intent was in writing the article? Like, what was
Again,
the outcome?
This was back in 1979, and honestly, I think it kind of, and this is my interpretation, please, this is not the Navy stance, but it's my interpretation. I think we're kind of seeing similar environment today within politics, which is, I think that there was, this really struck a nerve with a group of people who did not believe that women should be taking men's positions, what previously were men's positions. And so this was a means to add credibility to that argument. He was medically retired from the Marine Corps. He was he was a graduate of Georgetown Law School. He had been running in political circles within Washington, D.C., and he was I don't know if he dreamed that he would be appointed as the youngest Secretary of the Navy by President Reagan, but perhaps he was looking to be, and again, this is the Carter era. So if you remember, I mean, when Reagan came in, it was considered, the pendulum swung from one way to another. So I do believe, my interpretation, he might have been posturing a little bit to set himself up for something different, something more later, a little bit later in his career.
Yes.
I'm going to take the last question for Suzanne. So several of our speakers have kind of talked about either UNDP or other development agencies, and you kind of hinted at sometimes the development agencies with good intentions actually do things that undermine women's role in the community. And I was wondering if you could just explain that or a way around that in the future.
To be honest, I don't have a great solution, but I will say that some of the development projects that aim to put women to work, which I've seen in northeastern Afghanistan and Tajikistan, well, they're working. I mean, they're up at 5 a.m., they're to bed at 11, almost every one of them are working. So when you add something else to bring them out of the household, again, the only women who can run something like that is an elite woman in any of these places, or a man. On the Afghan side, it's often more men. And so you're taking women away from these household chores that they actually just need to get done. And I think when, I was working with a group in the Wuhan corridor, and we went village to village. I worked on two different things. I worked on an opium and heroin drug demand reduction program, assessment and redesign, but then also we looked at different development projects throughout the entire Wuhan corridor. And each village had a different thing it needed. This one needed a water pump, this one needed to replant some trees, this one had a really intense heroin addiction, different issues. And we kind of identified, well, each village has its own context and its own culture and its own leadership, and we need to engage with that leadership and figure out what the village needs. And I think that that's not very conducive to development, because development wants to, well, let's go into this country and do this thing or this province, and I get that. So I don't know that there's a great solution. I recommended to this USAID project that they go and meet with the female leaders and figure out what they need in terms of getting the information from the agricultural extension offices and how they should do that. And they did some of that, and then actually, there was a new person at the embassy in Tajikistan who didn't like that we were interfacing with women and shut down the project. And they re-engaged it and did not engage the women at all anymore. So it's I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, I could give you a number of examples. There was one sweatshop that was really run by a woman. There were several, but there was one in particular that comes to mind where the woman was bragging that she got the children in the neighboring villages to be able to start sewing at age 8. And she ran it with the daughter-in-laws and these children, and she made a lot of money. But when we talked to other women in the villages, they said it was forced labor, they were not getting anything. But that was funded by UNDP, and they didn't know. So and then if you tell UNDP that that's going on, that's a really unpleasant conversation, so.
So we'd like to thank our panel for all the ways that they are challenging us to continue to look at the women, peace, and security agenda. And we thank you for your time.
Thanks, Sam. So we're going to take our lunch break, and lunch is ready. So it's within this building. If you go out to the main corridor, it's up on the 3rd floor, all the way down on this side of the building, and it's called the Kim Koo Room? Library. It's beautiful glass walls. The catering is set up, so they're ready for us to do that. And we'll be back in this room at 12:30 for our final panel. Thank you, everybody.